Hey y'all, I'm Drake and this is Drake Makes Art. So in the last video we talked about how shading is one of the most important elements for representing three-dimensional objects in a two-dimensional image. You know, it allows us to show how light bouncing off an object gives that object its form. Well, in this video we're going to shift to talking about perspective, which is a little bit more technical and really digs into how transitioning from 3 dimensions to 2 dimensions affects how we perceive objects. So let's get started. I want to start with a graph like most of us have seen in math class before. On this graph we have 2 dimensions, x and y. They are straight lines that stretch off into infinity, but for the purposes of our drawing are limited by the edges of the canvas. To add a 3rd dimension to this image, we would have to imagine a 3rd axis, let's call it z, that actually comes out of the page toward us and goes through the image into the distance. Now, in order to represent that 3rd dimension, we have to establish a couple of boundaries. First, we need to establish our horizon line. This is the line where the sky meets the ground, and it represents the limit of our 3rd dimension. Just as x and y are limited by the edges of the canvas, the horizon line provides the limit for z. Next, we need to establish our vanishing point. In the real world, objects get smaller from us as they get farther away, that is, as they move towards the horizon. So the vanishing point is the point at which they would vanish from our sight or become too small for us to see. The vanishing point can be any point on our horizon line, and you can think of it as the place where the z-axis meets the horizon. Now, let's say we want to draw a cube in this space. We can start with a square to cover our x and y dimensions, then our lines in the z dimension extend toward the vanishing point. We call this setup one-point perspective because there's only one vanishing point affecting our lines. You'll notice that in one-point perspective, lines in the x and y dimensions, also known as horizontal and vertical, are perfectly level and parallel, while lines in the z direction all converge at the vanishing point. And while this is a technically accurate representation of three-dimensional space, it's not exactly the most realistic. We don't always view objects from a point of view that has perfectly straight x and y lines. So how do we remedy this problem? Well, we add more vanishing points. Let's go back to our original graph. If we set a camera directly above the viewer of this image and pointed it down at the viewer, here's what the camera would see. If the viewer turned in a circle, they would always see a horizon in the distance. So let's imagine this circle represents the horizon all around the viewer. This line represents the plane of the image the viewer is seeing within their field of view, and this point is the current z-axis vanishing point. Earlier, we said that the vanishing point is where the z-axis meets the horizon, and we said that in our current image, the x and y-axes are limited by the edges of the canvas. But that doesn't mean they stop there. After all, these axes technically stretch off to infinity, which means that ultimately the x-axis will cross the horizon, creating another vanishing point. And if the viewer rotated their field of view to include this new vanishing point and produced a new image, there would now be 2 vanishing points on the horizon. If we drew a cube in this space, it would look like this. Notice how none of the horizontal lines, apart from the horizon itself, are running parallel to the horizon, but are angled towards the vanishing points. We call this configuration 2-point perspective, and while it's another step closer to a realistic portrayal of 3D space, it's not quite perfect yet because all of our vertical lines are parallel, which isn't something that happens in real life. To fix this, we need to add a 3rd vanishing point for our y-axis, though this can get a little tricky because there's not a horizon to follow in the y direction. Figuring out where to place your vanishing points is one of the biggest struggles for beginning artists. If you place them too close together or too far apart, your image will look distorted. To help with this, I want to remind you that these dimensions are always at right angles to each other, and with a little practice, you should be able to find configurations that work to create realistic representations. Also, here's what a cube in 3-point perspective looks like. Now, this isn't where the conversation about perspective ends. We could keep going and talk about like 4, 5, even 6-point perspective, but those techniques are a little advanced for a fundamentals course, and they're really only useful if you're trying to recreate certain optical effects like spherical or fisheye lenses. If you would like to see a video on those more advanced concepts, then let me know in the comments. But for now, Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you learned something about perspective and how it works. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more content like this, and I hope I'll see you next time when we make something new. Bye.